Good evening. In the public square, we come to borrow the words of a great prophet to reason together. Or at least that was the old ideal from the limits of a civic republican perspective. What happens when we join public discourse with stereotypes instead of facts? Tonight, we focus on the allure and the consequences of sweeping statements, in particular about what the historian Father Miguel Bernad liked to call the Great Island, Mindanao. I am John Nery, and you are in the public square. It started as a tweet posted in response to a news story about the reported plans of the incoming tourism secretary. Mindanao was not referenced in the story, but the veteran journalist Raisa Robles somehow thought first that it was about Mindanao, and second, that Mindanao was about the Abu Sayyaf. Do I exaggerate? Yes, by a bit, but only to drive the point home. Home to about one-fourth of the entire Philippine population, Mindanao is large, almost as large as South Korea, larger than Ireland, more than twice as large as Taiwan. Why? To generalize and to spread the blame, why is the Mindanao of our imagination so small? Our guests tonight are peace and democracy advocate Amina Rasul and human rights advocate Carlos Caloy Conde. Amina is a distinguished alumna of the University of the Philippines, the Asian Institute of Management, and the Harvard Kennedy School. She served on the Ramos cabinet as presidential advisor on youth affairs and is, among the many hats she wears, the president of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy. Caloy worked in the frying pan of journalism for 20 years before jumping into the fire of human rights work. He has served as Philippine correspondent of the Washington Post and the New York Times, and a senior researcher at Human Rights Watch. Like me, Amina and Caloy are proud Mindanaoans. Good evening, Amina and Caloy. Thank you for making time for our program.
Good
Good
evening,
evening, John.
John. Good
Good
evening,
evening,
Kaloy.
Amina.
Good evening. Let's start. Our show is on stereotyping Mindanao. Maybe we can start by uh, asking you what are some of the most common stereotypes that you've encountered about the land you call home? Start with Amina and then Kaloy.
Yeah, age before beauty, John. Kaloy. I grew up in Sulu. And growing up in Holo Sulu, I always felt comfortable in my skin, comfortable in my community. We were proud, Tausugs. We enjoyed our childhood. We'd play in the streets on moonlit nights. We'd play patintero. Look for dragonflies. So it was really a peaceful life, and we were actually richer than many of the areas in Mindanao that are now far richer than us because we had barter trade. And remember, Philippine Airlines used to fly twice a day to bring American tourists, and they'd stay in Holo overnight. We used to have steak. Would you believe? They'd eat steak and then they'd go back home. When I went to Manila for college at the University of the Philippines, my parents told me, under no circumstances are you to go to Cavite because that's a lawless area. The carnappers are there and the bandits are there, like Nardong Putik. So I was really scared of Cavite. So from decades ago to today, you're afraid to come to Mindanao? True, John, we did have problems with violent extremism with the Abu Sayyaf. But even 10 years ago, when the peace process had not yet succeeded, we still had tourists going to Davao, even Zamboanga City. So I cannot understand now that the peace process is succeeding, why all of a sudden are we being stereotyped again as the land of the lawless? It boggles the mind.
It does boggle the mind. Kaloy, what about you? Common stereotypes?
Well, as a Christian myself, the most probably the worst stereotype in Mindanao is that it is the land of Muslims, quote unquote, and by
Yeah.
that they mean Muslims that are who cannot be trusted, who cannot be, are violent and all of that, and this persists to this day. So that to me is the worst stereotype that we've seen in Mindanao, and more recently the stereotypes about the place being so violent, the place being so undeveloped. Uh, so a lot of the fears of Filipinos emanate from that wrong view of the island. It's just so sweeping. So I think, but a lot of this, I think, comes from that, discrimination and the racism, in fact, that a lot of Muslims have to suffer in Mindanao.
Yeah, I grew up in Cagayan de Oro like you did, and uh, I'm not. I was going to say experience, but rather was on the other side of that kind of racism. No? Unfortunately, that was part of the culture then, and perhaps up to now, and that might explain some of the stereotypes. No? Kaloy, you worked for many years with the Washington Post and the New York Times. What kind of stereotypes of Mindanao did you have to uh, set right?
Well, being a journalist for most of my adult life, or working life, working for these international publications who fly in to the Philippines with their own preconceived notion about the place because of Abu Sayyaf, because of 9/11, because of the war against terror and all of that. I had to do a lot of explaining to my colleagues about what's really happening in Mindanao, and you really have to push back. And even when I was, working for freelancing for local publications covering the many parts of the island, it was always a struggle for me to try to correct the narrative, or at the very least try to present an alternative narrative of the island. That has defined, in fact, my years in journalism. Is this constant struggle to try to educate or to open the eyes of even journalists,
Mhm.
uh, colleagues, uh, about the multifaceted issues that is Mindanao. So and to this day, it's still the kind of thing that I do in my own little way, and a lot of I mean, that's not to say that there hasn't been any improvement in the way the media covered Mindanao. I mean, there have been a few initiatives that were done to try to correct the narrative of Mindanao. But every now and then, something like this comes up, and then just pushes back to where we were.
Yeah, I
If we
agree.
have time, maybe we can. If we have time, maybe we can go back to the role that journalists play in propagating these stereotypes. Amina, you work with the international community. In fact, you launched and co-host this international podcast called She Talks Peace. What
Yes.
kind of stereotypes do you find yourself encountering when you deal with your partners in the international community?
Well, just like what Kaloy has discussed, the idea that Mindanao is every day beset with problems of extremism and violence, and I keep telling my friends, my colleagues, or people who would bother to listen to an answer. I said, in Metro Manila, you can get killed for 20 pesos or small change for no reason at all. And I would tell them, if you come to Mindanao and you get killed, it's for a reason. You don't get killed for no reason. Now, if you were a tourist, where would you want to go? To the place where you can get killed for absolutely no reason, get mugged for absolutely no reason? I mean, I think I'd be safer, far safer in in Mindanao. But that's an extreme. But the idea that Mindanao is a violent land, I thought we had gotten over that because the peace process came with it very positive news very positive signals. And now I don't understand where journalists are getting that from, unless there is an inherent bias which hasn't been changed in their thinking about Mindanao. Perhaps they should have been part, Kaloy, of. You remember back in the days when the peace process was not working so well, and peace journalism became
Mhm.
the capacity building thing for journalists, and a lot of
Mhm.
organizations went into teaching reporters about peace journalism. Maybe we should revive that so that people can change the lenses with which they look at communities in Mindanao. I mean, just go to Davao, General Santos, ride, go on the highways from Marawi to Davao. It's fantastic. It's beautiful. You have motorcycle riders who go freely from one city to another. So it's true there are still pockets of violence, but then you have them too in Luzon and in the Visayas. So do not say that Mindanao is the hotbed of violent extremism, because it's not.
If I may, John,
Go ahead, please.
if I may pick up on what Mama Mina said, about peace journalism. I mean, this is something that a lot of journalist groups, civil society have done in the Philippines, but in Mindanao. But I think I think it has failed to some degree, and I think the failure is because while journalists are willing to learn about peace journalism, about new ways to tell the story of Mindanao, there are certain constants in Mindanao, constants, and they haven't changed. Really strong factors about that's the reason why the media continues to cover Mindanao like it's like 1970 or 1980. One of these
Mhm.
is the role of the military in Mindanao,
Yeah.
not just on the island, but what they're doing in terms of controlling the narrative, in terms of their dynamic with the journalists. I remember when I was beginning,
Hold on,
when I was
Kalay.
yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to I want to emphasize that point. You wrote something very recently about the failure of journalists to reckon with the role of the military as authorities speaking on behalf of Mindanao. All right.
Yeah.
So let's circle back to that idea. So we're talking here about using military sources to define the Mindanao narrative. No? What can go wrong?
Well, the thing is that, John, if I don't know, my view is that the military's take on Mindanao has been always the dominant kind of
Yeah.
perspective in Mindanao, and that has shaped not just how the media works, but I think it also influences the policy.
Mhm.
And to this day, they still retain a lot of control or dominance of the way the media reports Mindanao. I mean, just look at the way they give out information about certain what you call this incidents, and it's only the military that's used as a source. Uh, Also, I think the basic uh, problem of how the media works, how journalists do their job, is also a factor here. I mean, the emphasis on violence, the emphasis on attacks or explosions and all of that. I mean, it's still there. I remember when I was starting out, we were all I've heard stories from journalists themselves who said that
Mhm.
the wires, for instance, would not run a story from Mindanao, from Zamboanga or Basilan if the body count is not high enough. And I think that persists. Now that's not to say that there have been no effort on the part of media to try to improve their coverage. There has been, except that the old stereotypes, the old way of doing things are still dominant. But again, going back to the role of the military here, I think uh, not a lot of attention is being given how the military is driving the narrative in Mindanao, how that is affecting how the outside world perceives Mindanao. I mean, let's look, for instance, at the advisories that the embassies are using to say
Mhm.
that a certain part of Mindanao is off limits and a certain part are
Mhm.
okay. Those are a lot. The basis for that are military
Mhm.
reports. And my contention is that the job of the journalist covering Mindanao is to try to unpack that, try to explain that. What do these advisories mean? I mean, nobody's even writing about the fact that these advisories are almost exclusively for foreigners, not for locals. But
Mhm.
you don't see that. You don't read that.
Yep.
Amina, aside from the military, who should we talk to define the Mindanao narratives?
Well, if they gave equal time, for instance, to reports by the Mindanao Development Authority,
Mhm.
they would see increases in investments, not just in Davao, but even in the autonomous region of Muslim Mindanao. If they bothered to take a look at the reports of the Philippine Statistical Authority, they would see that last year's statistical bulletins showed that the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region actually had an improvement in poverty levels. And the improvement was better than some other regions. But you don't hear about this in the news. If you did, then you would change the perception of Mindanao. If you looked at the cultural section and you see all of these young singers and dancers and poets having their own conferences and their own shows and their artwork, you would have an entirely different view of Mindanao. We cannot hide the areas of conflict, but it's not a military problem. The communities realize that, and so you have communities, church, academe, civil society, and law enforcement working on solving these problems in the pockets where it exists. And also, Kaloy, I mean, they shouldn't just look at violence at the hands of Islamic-based terrorist groups. We do have the CPP and the FNPA also active, in areas where you've got mining and where you have the indigenous peoples. But balance. I mean, I thought that was the role of journalists to have fact-based reporting, balance in their analysis. But oops, I forget. We're in the era of fake news nga pala.
Thank you, Kaloy. Is one of the constants sheer distance? You were telling me about you having to correct the misimpressions of maybe your desk, your bureaus, and so on. But is there also palpable? I mean, the distance between Imperial Manila and Mindanao, is that a factor also?
Oh, definitely. I think it plays a large factor in how journalists cover Mindanao. I mean, practically all of the journalists reporting out of Mindanao for national dailies, they're reporting to editors and desks in Manila who have, and a lot of times these journalists on the ground in Mindanao are being dictated upon by their bosses in Manila on what sort of stories to write. And you see there have been instances where local journalists, the ones who are based in Mindanao, are trying to push back and do better. But we're talking about journalists here who are underpaid, who are at risk, and so they're at the mercy of their bosses in Manila. And every now and then, to be fair, there are journalists who break out of that kind of mold and
Mhm.
do some really important stuff, like the people in Minda News, for instance.
Yeah,
They're
Carol
doing really,
Hernandez.
yeah, they're really doing terrific stuff covering Mindanao. Uh, and the main reason for that is because they don't have to report to Manila. They don't have to answer to their bosses in Manila. So a lot of the Manila-centric, methods or ways of doing journalism is part of the problem. And when you have people who are not even who haven't really gone to Mindanao in any significant amount of time, just in Manila, outside looking in, and only relying on military or business sources to write about the island, then you have a problem. As I pointed out in my post, there are stories in Mindanao. You don't even have to go to the military or to business people. Just talk to the local folks. Just talk to the local communities about what we're going through. Mindanao is an island, is a region that's replete with stories of, you know, injustice, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, a lot of struggling by people to try to take some agency of their life, but they are frustrated by the many systems that are in place, and one of them is this really I wouldn't I'm not trying to ascribe ill motive on the part of journalists who are covering Mindanao. I think a lot of
Mhm.
this has to do with ignorance. A lot of this has to do with, an unwillingness to get out of their comfort zone and try to explore the stories that matter in Mindanao.
Laziness.
Well,
Maybe
yeah,
laziness.
there's also that,
I
definitely.
Mhm.
have a question for the two of you. This
Yes,
past six
ma'am.
years, national government, the national scene, has been dominated by leaders from Mindanao. Why hasn't that changed the perception of Mindanao?
That's a that's a terrific question. I don't know. I don't know the answer to that,
Me
Amina.
too.
I can only guess. You know,
I,
I
I, I
think
think that's a great question.
Yeah, it is. It is. It's a terrific question. I mean, our presidency would always rattle off the names of people who
Yeah.
in their cabinets and all of that, and there have been really good. But the irony here is some of the leaders actually in the peace process in Mindanao are actually not from Mindanao. Na magaganda maayos na mga leader. So again, that's also something to think about.
I
But
think
I
one.
think just one quick point,
Sure.
John. I think uh, this only emphasizes the big role that the media plays, and I'm not just talking about the news media, the news media, even the entertainment media. Their depiction of Muslims, the depiction of the conflict in Mindanao leaves much to be desired. Every now and then you have a film by Marilu Diaz Abaya, but those are more the exception than the rule. The rule. Every now and then you have a book by Glenda Gloria of Rappler and Marites Vitok about Mindanao and the rebellion in Mindanao. But again, those are the exceptions. And these are almost always, these are, set aside, ignored by the press, by the media. And it really boggles the mind, as to use Amina's word.
Yeah, to go back to Amina's great question, one possible answer I would think is other stereotypes of Mindanao have been reinforced under the 6 years of Duterte. For instance, Mindanao as the milking cow of the Philippines, or Mindanao as the voter central. No?
Yeah.
When
Mm.
the birds and the bees of Lanao could vote and so on. I don't mean that it's still the same stereotype, but the stereotype is that you need the command votes of certain places. You deal with Mindanao, and I think unfortunately under Duterte, our first president from Mindanao, I think that
Yeah.
stereotype was reinforced
Yeah.
for good or ill.
And I don't
I have
understand
a.
that.
I'm sorry.
I don't understand that because you also have command votes in other places in the Philippines, in Luzon and in the
That's
Visayas.
true. That's true.
And then there's this other thing, John. When they talk about political dynasties, they
Mhm.
immediately think of Muslim Mindanao. And I keep telling them, excuse me, political dynasties started in Metro Manila. And the Muslims thought, hey, magpapaloko ba tayo? If they can do it in Makati and Quezon City, and we certainly can do it in BARM. And if you look at the electoral results, dynasties didn't start in Muslim Mindanao.
That's that's
Yeah.
actually a great point, Amina. If I may just emphasize that, I think that's one of the stereotypes of Mindanao that's really grating to my nerves, is that a lot of the bad things that are happening in the national politic, in the way in our
Mhm.
politics are something that incubated in Mindanao. One
Yeah.
of those is uh, traditional, political
Command vote.
dynasties.
Mhm.
And also violence, election
Mhm.
violence.
Mhm.
Uh, you know, uh, the northern Philippines, and practically every part of the Philippines, for that matter, has its share of horrific violence during elections. In fact, during the past elections, in my monitoring, I could probably say that more violence in terms of extrajudicial killings of barangay captain and all of that
Mhm.
happened outside of Mindanao than in
Mhm.
Mindanao.
Yeah.
So that's a really, really unfair stereotype that persists to this day.
And maybe it's one of the constants that you referred to, Kaloy. This often unarticulated racism.
Yeah.
Uh, Amina started about the political dynasties, being Muslim families and so on. And as a matter of fact, in terms of uh, proportion, there are of course more political families that are non-Muslim, political dynasties that are non-Muslim. Yeah.
Yes.
So yeah. I mean, I wanted to ask you, by the way, I just realized now that when I introduced this segment, I used a quote from, the great Jesuit Father Miguel Bernard when he referred to the great island of Mindanao. But you are from Sulu. Do
Yep.
you feel that you're great using the great island as a phrase in a way is also a stereotype? Do you feel left out when I use that term?
Well, this is the thing. I belong to the Sultanate of Sulu. So we never really felt bad
Mhm.
when we were not included in Mindanao because we always thought, hey, we are a sultanate, we were
Mhm.
sovereign, we were a sovereign power once. So
Mhm.
perhaps that's why there isn't really that much of a reaction coming from the islanders when
Mhm.
they say Sulu, Palawan, and Mindanao.
Mhm.
I'm I'm just surmising that that might be the reason we don't find it too offensive.
Thank you. Maybe just the last couple of questions. Let's focus on what can be done. Kaloy, why are stereotypes, like in this case, no, stereotypes that are maybe 2 decades old, why do they still have such a hold on our imagination, at least among Manila journalists? And what can be done to break that stranglehold?
Well, you know, it would be easy to just uh, look at this as a form of laziness on the part of journalists, and that would be, I
Mhm.
think, simplistic and probably even unfair. But the thing is that, jour- you know, journalists, I think, particularly those covering from Manila, the first thing that they should do really is to just look at Mindanao through a different lens. I'm not saying ignore the military's lens or perspective. I'm not saying
Mhm.
disregard them altogether. I'm just saying that there are other ways of looking at the issue of Mindanao. There are other ways of looking at terrorism. There are other ways of looking at at the many human rights abuses that are happening there, or even other ways of explaining why certain regions or province in Mindanao are performing better than others. It's just that this military-driven narrative has been the dominant one ever since, and I think that needs to change. And if journalists, I'm not saying that these journalists are under the control of the military, or that they're being paid or threatened by the military. I don't think that's the case. I think they're just so used to how it's done that way. That's why they're doing it. And I'm not even just referring to journalists who are based in Manila. I mean, God knows a lot of Mindanao-based journalists themselves are not doing any better in terms of covering the island. So really, it's just a matter of really expanding your view. Including other voices. To not necessarily discard the voices of the military or the government, but to include the voices of the common Mindanaoans, of the common people who are eking out a living and trying to struggling to survive, and as I said, endlessly looking for justice in Mindanao.
And Amina, aside from maybe a return to or an updating of peace journalism, what are some of the things that you recommend journalists and other people interested in Mindanao do to ground and refine different lenses uh, with which to look at Mindanao?
Well, for journalists, I must agree with Kaloy. The role of a journalist is really to make sure any analysis you make is fact based. And when you go fact based, you cannot rely on only one source. I mean, I thought it journalists always double check, triple check sources to make sure that what they report on is truth. I mean, there's no absolute truth these days. I mean, there are so many different versions of truth. But if you only rely on one source, that's very, very dangerous. And for the public at large, I really would say the first thing you can do, the easiest thing you can do, is to go online and read Minda News online. And you will see all of the different things that's happening in Mindanao, from business and investment to art and to what's the latest book that's been produced by a Mindanaoan. That is the easiest for the public at large.
Thank you. Let me also say something in all sincerity about the good work of our own Rappler Bureau in Mindanao, led by a former colleague of Kaloy's, Herbie. Um, well, unfortunately, time is up. Amina Rasul and Kaloy Conde, thank you for your time, your insights, your pride in Mindanao, and your work illuminating the public square. Thank you.
Thank you for
Thanks.
having us, John.
Let me end as I started. The Mindanao in reality is large. We should not let the Mindanao of our imagination to be so small. That's it for us tonight. The next step for engaged citizens is always to take a more active part in rebuilding our democracy. See you in the public square. This is John Nery. Thank you and good night.